Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Goldstone, and in this series we'll explore the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew in light of early Jewish literature. In this first video, we'll discuss the reasons why it's so important to study the Sermon on the Mount in a Jewish setting. And then in the next few videos, we'll take a more in-depth look at several examples of how Jewish sources can help us to better understand this section of the Gospel.
The Gospel of Matthew is one of the most important sources for learning about Jesus and his early followers, particularly in their Jewish context. Matthew is often considered the most Jewish of the Gospels for a number of reasons, including its many references to the Hebrew Bible, its 5 major discourses that mirror the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the opening genealogy, which highlights Jesus' Jewish ancestry, and the Gospel's emphasis on Jesus' fulfillment of Scripture. Looking at the first of these factors, we find that the Gospel of Matthew may contain more than 50 references to verses from the Hebrew Bible, largely from the Pentateuch, as well as Psalms and some of the major prophetic books like Isaiah and Hosea.
These many allusions suggest that the author of the Gospel was well acquainted with Jewish scriptures, and that reference to these foundational works would have resonated with the Gospel's intended audience. In addition to numerous allusions to the Hebrew Bible,
scholars have identified 5 major discourses in the Gospel of Matthew that perhaps parallel the 5 books of the Pentateuch. This 5-part macro structure suggests that the Gospel represents a new Torah.
A third prominent link between Matthew and the Hebrew Bible is the opening genealogy.
The very first chapter in the Gospel of Matthew begins with an extended record of generations from Abraham, the first Jew, to King David, who is said to be the ancestor of the Messiah, all the way through Joseph, husband of Mary, the mother of Jesus.
By linking him to Abraham and David, this genealogy establishes Jesus as the legitimate heir to Judaism and sets him up as a messianic figure. One final link between the Gospel of Matthew and the Hebrew Bible that we can note is the way that the Gospel presents Jesus as fulfilling Scripture.
For example, Matthew indicates that as a child, Jesus was rushed to Egypt in order to save him from the threat of King Herod, who sought to kill him. The Gospel declares that this descent to Egypt was actually preordained in order to fulfill what had been spoken to the prophet Hosea. In this and many other places, the Gospel of Matthew portrays Jesus as a messianic figure by demonstrating how events in his life map onto prophecies from the Hebrew Bible.
We've seen how the Gospel of Matthew has many connections to Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. Let's now narrow in our focus to the Sermon on the Mount.
The Sermon on the Mount is the first of the 5 major discourses in the Gospel of Matthew, and it appears in chapters 5 through 7. In these chapters, Jesus addresses the people from a mountaintop, offering sagacious teachings for living one's life. Speaking to the people from atop a mountain is a familiar motif that also appears prominently in the Pentateuch, where Moses descends from the top of the mountain to speak to the Israelites. In contrast to the parallel to this material in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus speaks from level ground, here in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is presented as speaking from the mountaintop, portraying him as a new Moses.
The comparison to Moses continues with the content of Jesus' so-called antitheses found in Matthew chapter 5. The major themes of these antitheses align with many laws found in the Torah.
The first antithesis speaks about murder, mirroring the prohibition against murder in the Decalogue. Jesus' next attack on adultery parallels the subsequent commandment in the Decalogue. The third of the antitheses on divorce can be linked to the discussion of divorce in the book of Deuteronomy. With the fourth antithesis on oaths, we return to material found in the Decalogue. The last 2 antitheses discuss lex talionis, or eye for an eye punishment, which appears in the book of Exodus, and the love of neighbor, which brings us to the book of Leviticus. So all of the major topics discussed in the Matthean antitheses correspond to laws that can be found in the Torah.
In fact, not only the content of these antitheses closely aligns with Jewish sources, but even the form as well may perhaps parallel other Jewish literature.
The Matthean antitheses employ a somewhat unique formulation within the Gospel, reflecting rhetorical structure that's also found in many places within early Rabbinic Midrashic works. Both Matthew and the Midrashim open by using the language of hearing. Jesus notes that the people may have heard a particular law, and the Midrash quotes a biblical verse followed by a likely interpretation, introduced with the language of hearing. Both Matthew and the Midrash then proceed to reject the proffered law or interpretation, using the language of speaking. Jesus says to the audience what the correct practice should be, and in the Midrash, Scripture says something else which leads to a reinterpretation of the original verse.
Although there are certainly important differences between the antithesis form and the rhetorical structure of the early rabbinic Midrashim, scholars have pointed to the similar language of hearing and speaking, as well as the quotation and rejection of earlier laws, as significant parallels, linking the Gospel of Matthew to its broader Jewish context.
In this first video, we've highlighted a number of different features of the Gospel of Matthew as a whole, and the Sermon on the Mount in particular, which link this material to the Hebrew Bible and encourage us to examine this text more closely within a Jewish setting. In the next 3 videos, we'll take a closer look at several specific examples of how Second Temple and early rabbinic literature can help us to elucidate the Sermon on the Mount.